Welcome to Post-Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja. And in this video, I have combined all the four parts of my discussion of four sections of William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury. Now, these sections are available as standalone individual sections as well, but I thought maybe it would be useful to a lot of you if I could provide them in one single video. So from now till the end of this video, these are all the four sections of The Sound and the Fury and my discussion of them. Enjoy. About part one of Sound and the Fury. If you have already watched my introduction to the novel, I had sort of promised that I'll cover each narrative section. There are four narrative sections in separate conversations. So today I'll be talking about part one of the novel, which is from the beginning of the novel up to page 75 in my edition of the corrected text of the novel. Now, this section can also be called Benji section because we are in the narrative and we see and experience the world from the point of view of Benji Compson. Now, as I had mentioned in my previous conversation, Benji is intellectually challenged. He cannot speak, and he experiences the world through his senses, through his auditory senses, through vision, through touch, through smell. So in a way, it's a really experimental part of the novel because what Faulkner is experimenting with is in terms of representing the feelings and thoughts of someone who technically cannot speak and who is considered not fully capable of reason and logic by people around him. So while you read this section, here are certain tips to reading it. This section has three temporalities in it, three divisions of time. We start the section in the present. That is Benji's 33rd birthday. Then as we are reading it, we are privy to Benji's own flashbacks, which are given in italics. And then we have references to Benji's childhood and his teenage years. There is no linearity to this narrative. So you have to be extra careful as you read it. You have to constantly remind yourself as to where you are, what part of Benji's life you are in. Now, originally it is said that when Faulkner wanted to publish it, he wanted each part of the narrative in a different color, which, of course, his publishers at that time told him was not possible. There is a special edition of the novel where the publishers did use different colors, but I have no access to it. So what I've advised my students to do is to mark on every page, kind of either with a marker if the book is their own, or at least draw lines where they can tell themselves as to what part of the novel they are in. I mean, these are my own notes on it, so you can clearly see that I am also marking as I read. Now, another tip in trying to figure out where you are in Benji's story is to remember who is taking care of him. Now, Benji has caretakers throughout the narrative, right? So if Versh is referred to or mentioned as his caretaker, we are in Benji's childhood. Okay. If Luster is taking care of him, then we are in the present. And if his caretaker is TP, then we are in his teenage years. Now, what are the themes that emerge in this part of the novel? Let's take a look at those. So first of all, it's important to keep in mind that time is a generic theme in this part of the novel, and time as non-linear, right? Time as out of joint, as not moving in a linear fashion. And we immediately know that because Benji keeps shifting from the present to the past to his teenage years, which kind of also maybe is trying to represent how his mind works, right? One aspect of not being able to function as the world expects us is to not being able to find a linear way of thinking and acting. So time. Here, time is disjointed and it doesn't move in the linear fashion. Then another important theme in the story or in this part is Benji's relationship with Caddy, his sister. Now, Caddy is the only one, as it comes across to us, who actually cared about Benji, and Benji loves Caddy, right? And that is an important part of this novel. And then, of course, it's how Benji describes or experiences things, right? Sometimes the sentences are really interesting because his view is metonymic. He sees a part, the hand moved away, the darkness came in, right? And that's his way of interpreting the world and thinking about the world. So in terms of plot, if we could decipher it, in the beginning of the story, Benji and Luster are walking along the fence, right? And across the fence is a golf course. This used to be the family land, which was eventually sold, and people actually come and play golf there. But Benji doesn't understand that. He doesn't know the difference of property ownership and all, right? So we start there. Then there are childhood memories of the kids, the three brothers, Benji, Jason, and Quentin, and the sister Caddy, playing in the branch, in the stream close by, getting in trouble, right? And a lot of snippets of Caddy's relationship with Benji, how lovingly she talks to him. She's the only one who understands him. And Benji remembering the childhood memories of Caddy, right? But also as Caddy grows up and leaves, all of that is part of Benji's memory. And his associations with the name Caddy are so strong that when in the golf course, the golfers call for their caddy, it immediately sends him into a thought process about Caddy, his sister. Another important reference within the novel is, of course, Benji's sterilization, right? His chemical castration. And that happens after an incident when he gets out of the gate and chases these young female school students, of course, which poses him as a threat to children, and he is sterilized. Now, this policy of sterilizing what legally people were considered at that time, and the term that was used legally was feeble-minded, or people who were a threat to society, it was followed in pretty much all states of United States, right? And it was part of the eugenics movement, the movement that somehow wanted to maintain a certain purity of race or humanity, whatever you want to call it. There are references in this part of the novel to sending Benji to Jackson, kind of mentioned as a threat. Now, that is that Benji might be institutionalized by the state. So Jackson is where probably the facility is for intellectually challenged adults and children. We also get to know here in this part of the novel about the parents, mother, who is a hypochondriac, right? She is always ill, right, or sick. She doesn't have much love for Benji. She thinks that Benji is a kind of a punishment for him, for her. And then the relationship between the children and Dilsey, who is the matriarch of the servants and who basically takes care of all the children. We also have some foreshadowing about the characters of the two brothers. What comes across to us is that Quentin isn't much about him, but that he's reflective. Jason likes to be alone, right? And he is the one who tells on his brother and sister. He's the one who chops up all the dolls that Caddy had made for Benji, paper dolls, right? So there is a sort of foreshadowing that maybe he is also not somewhat right in his head. Maybe there is something wrong with him too. Overall, in this section, what we get then is Benji's life in the present and his experience and how Luster takes care of him, guides him through, and how Benji thinks about the world. We get flashbacks into his childhood with his brothers and sisters, but especially about Caddy, and we get flashbacks to his teenage years. Within this narrative is also the mention of Uncle Maury, who is their mother's relative and lives with them, parents, mom, and then an errand that Uncle Maury sends Benji and Caddy, and that is delivering a letter to Mrs. Patterson, who's a neighbor. We don't know what's in the letter, but they both do that. And that's when Benji stays on this side of the fence and Caddy jumps over and goes there. But by and large, what we get then is also the relationship of the children with each other, with their parents, and the role that the servants, and especially Dilsey, plays in keeping the household together. One thing that becomes really clear in this section is that none of these children are having a normal childhood, and the ramifications of it would be on their future life. So by the time we get to the end of the Benji section, we are in the past when Benji is a child, right? And their father is putting them to bed. Now, within this part of the novel, we also learn that Benji's original name used to be Maury, and it was changed to Benjamin. And according to Caddy, the reason was because it's a biblical name. But probably the reason, unstated though, is that maybe there was a belief that if a child is special, if you change their name, maybe it will change their destiny or change their state of mind as well. But we don't know the exact reason why his name was changed, but his mother likes the new name, Benjamin, right? So these are some of the details we get in this part of the novel. So let me kind of explain again the best way of reading this part, and that is make notes, mark on the pages, right, where you are. Are you in the present? Are you in Benji's flashbacks? If it's a flashback, it will be in italics. Then you have to figure out, if you're in the past, which past are you in? Is it his childhood or his teenage years? Also, sometimes you could be in the past and you read a few paragraphs, then there is a flashback or something else, or you're in the present, but then the story continues. You can see that bottom of page 9, the story ends and we have some other details, but then on page 13, the same narrative continues. Children playing and jumping into the pond, other part of the story, and then what do they do, like as they approach the house and their clothes are wet. So you'll have to do a really careful reading in order to really get at what's going on in this section. Okay, so overall, this is a pretty inconclusive rendering of part one of the novel, and that probably teaches us how perplexing this part is and can be. As always, my recommendation is read as carefully as you can, take notes, mark the text, especially to figure out where you are at any given time in the story, and maybe that would help. So that's all I have about part one of the novel. I don't find it to be a very conclusive explanation of it, but I hope you can find something useful in this. But do read the novel, and as I said, be extra careful as you read different parts of this section, and take notes and highlight the text, and maybe then you'll be able to, work your way through it. Today I'll be talking about part two, which focuses on Quentin Compson. Now, an important thing to keep in mind is that while all the other sections, the three sections, are set in 1928, this section actually is about June 2nd, 1910. So it's earlier than the other three sections. Another thing to keep in mind is that in this section, it's probably the longest section. It starts at page 76 and ends at page 178 or 179 in my edition of the novel. Now, this section covers, in terms of its temporality, temporal setting, one day in Quentin Compson's life. And that's the day that he actually plans and then eventually, as it is implied, it's not stated, commits suicide. That's the day that is captured over here. Now, if you read the Benjy section and struggled with how to make sense of it, you probably entered section 2 assuming that it would be easier than section 1. Actually, that's what I had thought. But actually, it's harder than section 1 or part 1 of the novel. And the main reason for that is that in this chapter, Faulkner is being the most experimental with stream of consciousness. And it becomes clearly evident because one aspect of stream of consciousness, if you've read about it, you already probably know, is that the author is trying to capture how a character's mind works. So you will run into sentences where it doesn't absolutely make sense because there are no punctuations, there are no transitions from one time period to another. In one sentence, you could be in the present. In the next sentence, you are somewhere in the past. And you as a reader has to then make sure that you try to figure out where you are. So my suggestion to my students is, and that's what I followed too, is to constantly annotate the book, pointing it to yourself as to where you are. So I constantly marked where we were in the present, and then I went on to highlight when we make shifts from present to the past. And that kind of gives a general map as you read the section. Now, if you were to imagine this section, just imagine that Quentin is at the center of it. We start in the present. He has just woken up. He's talking about listening or hearing the watch. He is constantly concerned with time. In opposition to Benjy, whose experience of reality was almost timeless, right? So Quentin is obsessed with time. And he also relies on memories of his conversations with his father giving him a lot of wisdom words. To me, they come across as mock wisdom, as something that is not to be taken seriously, maybe a bit pompous, but you can read it and then make up your mind what you think. So in the present of part 2, Quentin wakes up. If I were to talk about the plot, he takes his watch to a clock shop, asks the clockmaster about which time was correct on one of the several clocks, doesn't give his watch for fixing, then finds Dean, who is an attendant at Harvard, and gives him a letter, right, for Shreve. He posts a letter, and then he takes a tram car outside the city. And he goes to the river where the river is almost entering the ocean. In the process, before he leaves the city, he also buys 2 iron weights, kind of like irons. And there are hints that he's looking for the ideal spot, which he finds and hides under the bridge, the iron weights, as he's thinking about how they would eventually float up. But this is all done in a really subtle way. But he is literally mapping the path that he will take and the spot that he will use to eventually commit suicide. As he's returning from there, he has different kinds of adventures, right? We are privy to his views, highly racist views of Black people. We also see him interact with a young Italian girl whom he runs into in a bakery, who is lost, and he's trying to find her house. And we are given a glimpse into how the Italian immigrants at that time are viewed by the majority population, right? And they are not viewed very positively. Gets arrested for supposed kidnap of the young girl, but then that's when his friends from Harvard who were picnicking that day find him, and then he ends up being with them in a car. And eventually, because of one of his friends, or not friends, but college fellows, Gerald's views on women, he gets into a scrape with him and gets beat up, right? At least he's bleeding, and he goes back to his room, meticulously cleans his vest, takes a shower, cleans himself, leaves a letter for, actually doesn't leave the letter for Shreve, takes it with him, and there is a mention of the post office on the way. And all we know by the end of this section is that he has walked out of his Harvard apartment and he is on his way, fully dressed, looking nice. And we can construe that he is on his way back to the spot that he had picked up. That's roughly the present of part 2. Now, there's a lot going on through memories and flashbacks in part 2. Part of what we learn through his flashbacks and memories is his relationship with his father, right? That the father tries to give him some advice, some wisdom about how to deal with virginity, how to think about time, right? How to enjoy life even. And that we learn that the father had sold the pasture to pay for his Harvard education. We also have a repeat views of that day when Benji, Caddy, and they all play in the stream, right? So we hear that again. Then a major part of this section is his reflections on his relationship with Caddy. Now remember, Benji is obsessed with Caddy, but his love for Caddy is more, I would say, natural, it's dependent, and Benji is intuitive about his relationship with Caddy. Quentin's relationship with Caddy is more problematic. It almost has incestual tones and obsessive tones about it. He obviously loves Caddy, but he's also jealous of her promiscuity, right? And her relationships with other men. So a lot of the memories that they have are the memories of Quentin and Caddy talking about what's going to happen to her, how many men have been there in their lives. And there is a point where Quentin actually offers her, we could run away, we could use this money that is for my college and live off of it. So a lot of memories of Caddy. There are two fights that Quentin loses. I mean, they're not really fights. I mean, he gets punched or he's very ineffectual. The first one is when he asks Dalton Ames, the guy who had gotten Caddy pregnant, to meet on the bridge. They both ride up there. Actually, he walks there and Dalton Ames rides up there. There is no fight. Dalton is much more stronger than Quentin, and he treats Quentin like a boy. Maybe he makes him feel emasculated. So that's the first scene where he makes Caddy's honor a reason for a fight and a challenge. The second fight is towards the end on the same reason, because Gerald is talking ill of women. He is a womanizer. And Quentin famously, as he had said to Dalton Ames, do you have no sister? And they fight, and Quentin gets punched. And, he's bleeding as Shreve takes care of him, and he goes back to his apartment. So the characters that are mentioned or that appear in this section, of course, the mother, the father, Benji is mentioned, Jason is mentioned, Caddy, of course, is a big present, but then are his Harvard characters, Harvard colleagues, Shreve, who is his closest friend. Then we have Spode, I think he's a Canadian, Gerald, who is sort of a playboy, and Gerald's mother, right, who really loves her son and, drives around with her son. And then we meet Deacon, who is kind of a custodian, but he's also the guy who provides different kinds of services to the students, right? And he's very entrepreneurial. That's how he is represented. So these are some of the characters in this section. Now, I briefly already mentioned how to read it. But remember, this is a modernist novel, right? This is not something that you pick up and read at a train station. The way a modernist novel, and especially this one, the way they are crafted are as pieces of art, right? And they require that kind of careful reading. So when you start reading it, you probably already read part 1, maybe you're reading it for your class, and when you read part 2, please have your own copy of the novel and annotate. Keep reminding yourself where you are and look up things. There are classical references, a couple of them in this one too, which I probably have missed, but if you pose a question, I'll be happy to answer it, but you have to read it with that kind of care. So overall, Quentin's section, we can construe that on this day he commits suicide. But there is no harrowing scene of suicide. All we see is his meticulous preparation. We also get a sense of his mental state and maybe his way of thinking of himself and of life that could have made him prone to suicide. Which also tells us that part of this family's life, right, is all the characters in it are traumatized characters, right? In a way, they may be paying the price for the past ills of their family. We could read it like that too. But in personal lives, they're all traumatized characters. They carry different kinds of trauma, and they have different kinds of coping strategies. Quentin's is to be obsessive about time, to be meticulous. And that comes across pretty clearly in his meticulous planning of his eventual suicide. So these are all some of the thoughts I have about part 2. It's not much, but obviously that's all I can offer, and I, with the hope that you will carefully read this section and then talk about it, and especially pay attention to the language and the vocabularies employed and how part of this section is deeply philosophical. For example, one reference is to St. Francis, where he talks about death being the other sister, right? So death being a sister as something that you await in the end, and it meets everyone. That references in the very beginning of part 2, but also in this case, maybe tangentially, the cause of his death is what he feels towards his sister, which he tries to sublimate into a fight for honor. But as you read carefully, you can see that it's some sort of obsession, and maybe sexual obsession. Now we know that Quentin is a virgin, right? And that anxiety is already part of his conduct. And that's what his dad tells him. Look, you don't understand these things happen. So we have to keep that in mind as well. We also have to keep in mind the time frame. This is 1910. Okay, so this is not even the present temporality of the rest of the sections. This is 10 years before that. So these are some of the things that I've gleaned from part 2. I hope these are useful to you. If you have any questions, anything that you would like me to elaborate further, please feel free to post it in the comments, and I'll be very happy to respond to any of your queries and questions. Third part or third section or third chapter of the book, which is focused on Jason. Now, in my edition of the book, it goes from page 180 to 264. And an important thing to keep in mind about part 3 is that it is set on April 6th, 1928, which is one day before the Benji section, because that one is set on April 7th, 1928. So what I'll do in this brief introduction to this section is share my impressions of Jason as the narrator of this section, and then share whatever I understand of the plot or what happens. So keep in mind, it is one day in Jason's life, which is complicated by a lot of detail that is provided to us from the past. So first, what do we learn about Jason in this section in the present? He lives in the house with his mother and Miss Quinton, his niece, who is Caddy's daughter. She is 17. He works at a farm store which is owned by a guy named Earl, and his co-worker is a black worker. His name is Joe. We also know that he drives an automobile. We have to figure out how he got it. And the household still retains the African-American servants, including Dilsey, her children and grandchildren, who live on the property and still serve the household. In the house, mother is still alive, but she is, as she always has been throughout the story, she is sickly and doesn't go out much. I think the most important part of this section is Jason's interactions with Quentin. His relationship with Quentin is deeply troubling because he wants to control her. He wants to dictate to her how she should behave, live her life, and had the mother and Dilsey not being there, it could have been a very violent relationship, but it's verbally abusive and semiotically violent relationship. And of course, Miss Quinton, on the other hand, is also, she doesn't take anything quietly. And of course, I forgot Benji. Benji is still alive, of course, and he also lives in the house. Now, in terms of the plot, what happens in this section is what we learn are different interactions. Earl's behavior with Jason. Earl kind of tolerates him because of his respect for Jason's mom. Jason also is investing, right? So he goes to the telegraph office to see what the reports are, and he's trying to get back the money that he has lost in his investment. Then is his whole project of stealing money from Miss Quinton. Now we know through this section that Caddy has been sending money for Quinton every month. What Jason has been doing is that since Caddy has been sending money orders, he's been cashing the money orders and holding the money in a metal box in his room. But to carry out this charade of burning the checks, he always fills a blank check from Caddy, puts it in the letter that she sends every month, and takes it to his mother, who is proud and who would not accept money from her daughter, and she ritually kind of burns the check. So while the mother is thinking that she is not taking any money from Caddy, Jason has been holding that money. And then he sort of blackmails Miss Quinton if he decides to give her like $10 or something. Now, in the present plot of the novel, what ends up happening is that the show is coming to town, the show that Luster talks about and wants the tickets to. And Jason sees Miss Quinton leave in a car with a guy, right, in a red necktie, and he follows them all the way, and he gets lost in the forest and finally is not able to find them and then comes back. But that's kind of his obsessive nature of trying to control Quinton's life. And part of it is driven by his idea of his social status, or what people would say about his family if his niece is going around in town. This was the concern in case of Caddy too, and it still is. And then by the end of this section, things are not resolved. We also get Dilsey's opinions, and we get flashbacks where we learn that Caddy had, when she had given her infant daughter to her parents, she regretted that decision. And one time when she wanted to just see her daughter, she gives $50 to Jason just to do that. And he's deeply cruel because he just drives by, right? Not drives by, but in a carriage. Then we also learn later that Caddy had offered him $1,000 if she could have Quinton back. We also know that Caddy has stayed in touch with Quinton and writes to her, right? They know each other. They have been in contact. So Caddy, in one way, has stayed in touch with her daughter. We also learn about the father's death and his funeral. We also know that Uncle Maury has been drawing money on Mom's account, and she kind of tolerates it. These are some of the factual aspects of the novel. Now, in terms of character, Jason, to me, as I read him, is probably one of the most despicable characters ever created. There is nothing redeemable about him, right? He's almost rude to his mother. He is insulting to his servants. He has this sense of having been wronged by everyone, as if the world owes him something and he doesn't have it. He's a sexist. He's an anti-Semite. All of these things are interspersed in this section. By the time we finish this section, we do not feel much sympathy for Jason. He doesn't let us do that, like the sympathy maybe we felt for Quentin, or of course, absolutely for Benji. He is a completely unsympathetic character with very few, I couldn't find a single one of positive traits. He's selfish, he's aggressive, he's violent, right? And he's driven by greed. But what we also learn is that he has internalized this idea that he was robbed of his inheritance. Actually, the mother supports that thesis, because when the pasture was sold, Quentin got the money to go to Harvard, which in Jason's view was wasted because Quentin committed suicide. Some of that money was used for Caddy's wedding, but he never got anything from that inheritance. We do know that he's been going into mother's account. That's how Earl kind of implies that he got his car. Overall, in this section, then, as you read it, I would highly recommend paying attention to all the flashbacks and locating where in time they are, his conversations with his mother, and his interaction with Caddy and also his co-workers. There's a moment also in this section where there's a conversation between mother and Jason is insisting that Miss Quentin is too much like both Quentin and Caddy. And he invokes this memory that they were always together. Dad never objected to it. And I think what he's implying is that probably Miss Quentin was born because of incest. It's not stated, but it's implied. You'll have to tease it out. So overall, just like all the other sections, I would say do not read with an expectation of a climax and then a falling down action, but rather read it as one day in Jason's life where we are privy to what he's doing, but also we are privy to his thought processes, and build up to the moment where in the next section we learn what Miss Caddy or Miss Quentin has done. But his relationship with Miss Quentin is pretty violent relationship, a relationship based in fear. And she obviously is afraid of him, but she's also defiant. So that's what I can safely say about this section. Now, in terms of style, it's more straightforward than the previous sections. There is less stream of consciousness probably, and more simple, linear kind of narrative. But still, you have to read it carefully, annotate, take notes. And the reason taking notes is important is because you do want to figure out where we are in the time frame of the story and distinguish between the present and the past, and then in the past, then what events, what is the chronology of those events. We have to figure that out in this section. Today, in the final video on my series on Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, I'll be talking about the fourth and final section of the book. Now, I've called it the Dilsey-Gibson section, but this is the only section of the novel that is narrated in a third-person narration. Now, the previous three sections were all narrated in the first person. So the Benji section, we are in Benji's mind, right? Jason's section, we are in Jason's mind. The Quentin section, we are in Quentin's mind. but this particular section is in a third-person voice. Now, first of all, there are advantages to a third-person narrative voice. You can obviously see that from the very start of this section. And one of the advantages is that we get more external descriptions of the characters and the space. So instead of being within the interiority of the first-person narrator, we are looking at the world from this detached third-person perspective. So the section starts with a description of Dilsey Gibson. Until now, we don't know how she looks like, right? Then there is a description of the house. Then we get an external description of Benji. So these are the advantages of the third-person narrator or narration that we can pinpoint as soon as we start reading this section. In terms of plot, what happens in this section? So in this section, we learn how Dilsey's day begins by starting the fire, making breakfast. We also learn how she handles the figure of the mother, Mrs. Compson, how she deals with Jason, how she deals or thinks about lovingly about Miss Quinton, right? How she's protective of her. And then her treatment of Luster. He's the only one of the grandchildren, I think he's a grandchild of hers, who appears in this section, even though there are references to Teepee. So we kind of understand that she is a central figure in this household, and it comes through in this section. Another important thing in this section is, of course, we learn part of Jason's quest, right? By this time, Miss Quinton has run away. Jason is trying to follow her, right? He assumes that she is going to be where the show, the person with red necktie who supposedly from the show that was in town, that she has escaped with him. So he follows, he drives all the way to the place where the show is next being held. He has an encounter with a person in a trailer, almost gets in a fight, and then he's escorted out of there by the show manager. And the show manager tells him, look, they are no longer here. So obviously they are gone, Miss Quinton and her male friend. So Jason then in defeat returns. But as he's driving up there, Jason has these thoughts. He thinks of himself on this quest. He thinks of himself as this warrior figure. But he's more worried about two things. He's mad at the sheriff for not helping him. And he's really mad because a woman, Miss Quinton, has robbed him. And so that gives you some peculiar information about his sexism and his other delusional aspects of his character. Now, an important thing to keep in mind in this entire experience is the amount of money that he had stolen from Miss Quinton is $3,000. That's what she has run away with. So by the end of his quest, he is returning back. He has paid someone $4 to drive him back because he has a headache. Another important aspect or event in this section is Dilsey Gibson, along with Benji and other black people of the town, visiting the Sunday service of a black church. And that's really wonderfully described as people are walking to the church, and then the experience of the church itself. They have a visiting pastor, and everyone has been talking about it, that he's a powerful orator and speaker, but when they see him, he's this frail old man, and they're like, well, this guy doesn't look like the preacher people were talking about. And so the preacher first gives a normal sermon, what they consider the white people's speech. And then he switches into a more charismatic sermon, right, in the dialect that the people speak. And that's where you get the power of the performative aspect of a black church, right, where the audience participates in the process of the sermon. And I think that's wonderfully done. And it could give us, from a third person perspective, the spiritual lives of former slaves who are still, trapped in the same lives, working for the same former families. And we also know in this section that this family is at its end. Dilsey says a number of times, I have seen it, I had seen it in the beginning, and I'm seeing it at the end, something to like that. So we know that the family is ending. There was one other point in this section that kept baffling me as I was reading it, and that was Luster constantly keeps going into the basement, and Dilsey constantly keeps asking him, what are you doing in the basement? And I couldn't figure it out until finally I focused on his actions. So we see him with a handsaw, then we see him crafting a tool, but he says, I still can't do it. I need to find something to hit it with. And finally, I connected with his experience of going to the show. And one of the main events at the show was that a guy could actually play a handsaw like a musical instrument. And it struck me, oh, that is what he is trying to do. He has found the saw and he's trying to figure out how to play it like the guy in the show. By the way, I asked this question in a quiz of my students. I actually gave them the page number and Luster's quote, but they all had trouble actually understanding or giving a correct answer because the answer has to be found out by a careful reading of all the parts of the novel and not just part 4. So by the end of part 4, Benji, is troubled. He's crying. So Dilsey asks Luster to take him out on the carriage. The carriage is almost lopsided, and the horse Queenie is also old, and Luster has never driven a carriage before, but he's like, I can do it. So he takes Benji to the town. He's supposed to take him to the graveyard, but he takes a wrong turn and wants to take him around the town square. And Benji starts crying, of course, because that breaks his routine, right? And that's when we see Jason come and push Luster aside. I think he even hits him and he tells him, take him back. Okay, take him back home. And the novel ends at they driving back home. And here's the last line. The broken flower drooped over Ben's fist, and his eyes were empty and blue and serene again as cornice and facade flowed smoothly once more from left to right, post and tree, window and doorway and signboard, each in its ordered place. So the last lines of the novel kind of suggest that everything is in order, visually speaking. And that teaches us that by taking a wrong turn, what Luster had done was disturbed the way Benji views the scene as he's riding the carriage. And if you have taken care of anyone with special needs or know about someone, having things in an ordered form is crucial for their happiness, right? If you disturb something, they don't understand it and it distresses them. So in a way, then the novel ends where Luster is driving Benji back on a familiar path. And that's where the novel ends. It's an inconclusive ending, but that's how most modernist novels are, right? So overall, if we look at all the 4 sections, we learned about Benji's life and how he sees the world in section 1. Then we learned about Quentin, the time period of Quentin section in 1910, right? And one day in Benji's life, one day in Quentin's life, until we figure out or construe that Quentin commits suicide on that day. And then we have Jason's section, one day in his life. And the final section, in a third person narration, is mostly one day in Dilsey Gibson's life. But this is the section where we also get more information about the mother, more information about Benji's appearance, the house appearance, and other experiences of the church that we had not seen in the previous sections. So that's roughly my understanding of part 4 of The Sound of and the Fury. If you decide to teach this novel or read this novel, I would highly recommend reading it carefully, diligently, taking notes, pointing to yourself, where you are at a given narrative. And if you look at my notes, I mean, this book has kind of a mapping of where I am. You see, like I give myself these notes and point to myself where I am, how is this section connected to the others. But it will require, like any modernist novel, a careful and diligent reading. That's all. Thank you so much. Please let me know what you think of this series. And if you take a look at the playlist that comes up in a few seconds, there are a lot of other discussions on other novels as well. So please feel free to watch them. Thank you so much. Stay safe, be kind, and as always, from me to you, peace and love.